Back here on News Radio 1270 and 106.7 FM. It is 8:30. Joining me on the phone right now, I've got a special guest joining us. It is the Texas, or one of the Texas state senators, I should say. He'll be the keynote speaker at an event coming up. Texas State Senator Brian Birdwell joining us. Good morning, Senator Birdwell. How's it going today, sir?
It is going great, Vic. Great to join you and visit with the folks there in the great state of Wyoming. So, great to be with you.
All right. Now, great to have you on. You are a retired lieutenant colonel, a Gulf War veteran, and a September 11th Pentagon survivor. So, first off, let's start out with where you'll be. Saturday, November 18th, you'll be from 4 to 5:30 p.m. at VFW Post 9439 in Casper, Wyoming. What will you be discussing at this event?
We'll be discussing the returning the nation's system of federalism back to how the founders had intended it. So we're open to all veterans and those interested in preserving liberty in that regard, because in many respects, Vic, the states were the center of gravity of how we formed our nation. The states created the federal government, so the original 13 states created. And with every new state brought into the Union, Texas was 25th, when every new state brought into the Union comes in, they were adopted as heirs to the original 13 states. And so what's happened is the states have been supplanted as the primary place for domestic policy by the federal government. So fundamentally, instead of the federal government performing the tasks that the collective power of the states gave them in Article 1, Section 8, the federal government now treats the states, counties, and cities and other geopolitical subdivisions as nothing more than subcontractors to federal will.
Okay.
And so we're going to talk about Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution and how we can return the states to their proper role and rebalance the states' role in our federal system.
All right. Now, I don't want to talk any more on that. I want to talk about some, now that we know what the event's about.
Yes, sir.
Tell us a little bit about you as a Gulf War veteran. What branch of the military were you in, by the way?
Army.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Now, where were you stationed in your time?
I spent 20 years in the service. A lot of different schoolings, but my first 10 years I was a field artilleryman, so I've spent a lot of time at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My first troop tour was over in Korea in the 2nd Infantry Division. I was in the Western Quarter and spent 2 winters. Folks in Wyoming will probably laugh at this, but as a Texas boy, I mean, that was a shock to my system for that kind of winter, let me tell you. But 2 winters in Korea, 90 days inside the demilitarized zone, and then came back to Fort Riley, Kansas, to the 1st Infantry Division, and from there went on to other schoolings, eventually on to Germany in the 3rd Infantry Division, had a 5-month tour in the Gulf during the first Gulf War, Desert Shield and Desert Storm, came back to Germany, continued to serve in Germany for another 3 years, and then I've been stationed at Fort Leavenworth twice, once as faculty, staff, at Command and General Staff College in what's called a battle lab. It's a combat development job. And then I came back as a student. And in between that time, I was at Fort Lewis, Washington on the 1st Corps staff. 1st Corps is the Army 3-star command that has proponency for the Pacific Rim. So Thailand, Japan, Korea, Australia did a lot of planning associated with war plans associated with that. And then after that tour, went to the Pentagon, did everything in my power to try to not go to the Pentagon because, lieutenant colonels in the Pentagon are just galley slaves. The colonels get the coffee and the lieutenant colonels are just, lucky to be holding the creamer. But got there, had a great boss. I worked in the directorate of the Army staff that is essentially the city managers, the garrison, all the things that make Army installations their own city. It's called Installation Management, was the staff directorate, and on the morning of September 11th, I was serving as the aide to our deputy director, an SES-5, which is a 2-star civilian equivalent. And I had a 757 come through my window, and by the Lord's grace, I survived it as the only survivor in the E-ring at the crash site, and spent 4 years being medically put back together. And in 2005, began the process of returning back to Texas upon retirement in 2004, and then in 2010, the Lord put on my heart to seek elective office, because I'd had folks ask me to consider it with the retirement or the resignation of our previous current serving state senator, and the Lord bless that as well. And my wife Mel's been beside me for all 30 plus years of it, and so I do it again. I miss it. Veterans Day was a great Saturday, being out with veterans in the district, and I miss it immensely.
All right, let's talk about September 11th first off, and we were talking
Sure.
off the air because you and I have a lot in common in that regard of the fact, and I actually had my father on the air with us for Veterans Day, or on Friday in honor of Veterans Day. He served in the old guard. He did all the funerals and stuff at Arlington National Cemetery.
3rd Infantry Division. Third Infantry.
Yeah, he was stationed there at Fort Myer. But, of course, the Pentagon is a huge, huge building. For those that have never been to D.C., that have never, technically Arlington, because the Pentagon's not in D.C., it's in Northern Virginia, it's huge. And if I remember correctly, I think it's the largest office building in the world. It's because it's, all the levels underground as well. Were you... I mean, how was it? What was it like? I'll never forget the day. Of course, I told you, and listeners probably know by now, I'm from the D.C. area. I was living in Woodbridge, Virginia. I was going to Woodbridge High School, and Woodbridge is about 20 minutes south of D.C. there, or south of the Pentagon. And, the news was breaking, and everything happened. Can you go through what was going on that day for you? Was it a normal day at the start?
Yeah. Pretty much a normal day. Because I worked as a military aide to a flag officer, our staff director was actually hosting a conference over at the Doubletree across from the Pentagon, across 395. And so myself, Sandy, and Cheryl, Colonel Williams, who was General Van Antwerp's aide, and General Van Antwerp and Miss Menig was my boss, who I was the aide for. They went over to the Doubletree. That left Sandy, Cheryl, and myself to settle in for what we expected to be a slow day. About 9 o'clock, Sandy, my coworker, gets a call from her daughter Sam up in New York City. Hey, Mom, turn the TV on. The World Trade Center was hit by a plane, and we did exactly what everybody there in Wyoming was doing. Turn it on radio. I went into Miss Minig's office, turned on the TV, expecting it to be something that would only hold our attention for like a car chase in L.A. or something that you see being followed for 5 or 6 minutes. Turned on the TV and you see that huge gaping hole. No thought that we were next. I'd had my morning Coke that morning, that jolt of caffeine that all the galley slaves need, and so at about 9:35, after we'd watched the second crash, the Flight 175 crash in the South Tower on live TV, and that would confirm that neither were accidents. About 9:35, I stepped out, told Sandy and Cheryl I was going to go to the men's restroom. I'd be back momentarily, because I needed to Mother Nature was calling. I stepped out, went to the men's restroom. So your listeners have a clear understanding of what a miracle it is that I'm still alive today. If you recall that portion of the Pentagon that crumbles, that E-ring portion that crumbles, my window where my desk was is 4 windows over from the left side of where that crumbled, where the building shears off cleanly. When I stepped out of the men's restroom, or when I stepped out of my office to go to the men's restroom, I walked through what would crumble. I turned left up the 4th quarter, because the plane makes impact at the intersection of the E-ring and the 4th quarter. The E-ring is the circle, and the quarter is the spoke that connects all the rings. And the men's restroom's right there at that intersection. When I came out of the men's restroom, I'm about 7 or 8 steps walking back to the E-ring, and the first window to the right that is still intact, to the right of the collapse point of what crumbled, I'm about 5 to 7 yards behind that. And so by the Lord's grace, I'm the only survivor in the E-ring at the crash site. I was a 60% total body burn, inhalation injury. I mean, I should have been killed many times over that day, Vic.
Do you remember anything after the plane hit?
Absolutely. I mean, that's another one of the miracles that I wasn't not only was I not killed instantaneously, look, burns are absolutely one of the most agonizing injuries. But in that moment, what was really, there were three pains and emotions that I dealt with. First was the physical pain of the burns, but those were subordinate to knowing that I was at the peril of my life, struggling. I'd gone from a well-lit hallway in charge of my faculties in one moment, and in the next nanosecond, I am set ablaze in a black hallway with the exception, because all the lights are out. I mean, when an 80-ton bomb, a 757's 80 tons, and it had over 3,000 gallons on board still when it makes impact. The right engine is passing by me on the right. And when that impact occurs, I am set ablaze. I am tossed around like a rag doll. I am thrown across the fourth quarter, and I'm not knocked unconscious. But as I am set ablaze, I'm now in that, what really the definition of terrorism is. I am facing a life-threatening injury, and I am not in a position to escape the source of that injury. And that's really the terror that grabs your heart when you realize that. I did what the Lord creates every one of us in the womb when He knits us in our mother's womb, that desire for survival, that zest for living. I did everything I could to try to survive, to try to get up, but because of the concussion and the vacuum and of that blast, my inner ears are badly damaged, sense of balance is shot. And so I'm coming to that realization, and this is all happening in a matter of seconds to a minute or two. I'm coming to that and those seconds or minute or two lasted an eternity as you're sitting there waiting to die. And I came to that realization that I was no longer struggling for life. This was how the Lord was going to call me into eternity. And I did what we in the military are never trained to do. I collapsed to the floor and I waited to die, crying out in a very loud voice, "Jesus, I'm coming to see you." And then that third pain and emotion, as I lay there, now there's no physical pain of the burn, even though I'm burning. But I'm concentrating on that expectation of the soul departing the body. And while I'm waiting for that, I think about Mel and Matt that morning and how I'd said goodbye to them that morning in Lorton. And that feeling of the soul departing the body would never come. In fact, I'd be rescued. There's so many miracles that I wish I could. I know we only have 15 minutes, Vic, but I would eventually be evacuated. A number of miracles are all the reason that I'm still here with you today on the radio.
Did they send you?
Would occur.
Did they send you to Walter Reed?
No, sir. Walter Reed does not have a burn unit, and in fact, one of the Air Force nurses was on her 2 weeks of annual duty. She normally worked at Georgetown. Mm-hmm. Georgetown was the only hospital emergency room she knew how to get to. So we go to Georgetown, and I'm the only. That's another one of the Lord's provisions here. I'm the only casualty taken to Georgetown. So I have that entire hospital's undivided attention. But more importantly, the attending physician at Georgetown is Dr. Michael Williams. And Dr. Williams had just completed, because Georgetown is a teaching hospital.
Yes, of course.
Had just completed a 2-year trauma fellowship over at the Washington Hospital Center under the direction of Marion Jordan and James Jang. Dr. Jordan happened to be the director of the regional burn center at the Washington Hospital Center, and Dr. Jang was the chief of research. So from the perspective of all the emergency rooms in the D.C. area, I have the third best burn doctor available to me, and that's prescient because a great Wyoming named Dick Cheney gives the order right after the Flight 77 makes impact with the Pentagon. He gives the order to Secretary of Transportation Mineta inside the White House Situation Room to shut down all airspace. So when I arrive at Georgetown, airspace is already shut down. There are no helicopters flying, no nothing is flying in the nation's capital. So Dr. Williams, normally in an emergency room, it's airway, breathing, and circulation. But because he has the specific burn-centric training, he will begin to do the very brutal things that have to be done to me for me to survive. And that's the Lord's provision for me.
Did you ride in an ambulance or did you fly? Of course, Georgetown.
No, sir. I was in the back of a Ford Expedition. Captain Wineland. I'm teasing. He was an Army captain, He was qualifying for NASCAR that day because it wasn't the crash that nearly killed me. It was his driving in a chaotic D.C. traffic that about killed me in the back of that vehicle.
Let's see. The attack took place, around 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning that day, I'm thinking, if I'm trying to remember?
The 8:50 was the first crash in New York. 9:37 is when the crash occurs at the Pentagon.
Well, it's a doggone thing. It was
Eastern time.
Yeah, it was a doggone thing. Good it was after rush hour, because, boy, that would have been even more of a mess. A normal drive, for those that don't know, a normal drive from the Pentagon to Georgetown would be maybe 10, 15 minutes, somewhere around there.
Yeah. One of the things that if I may add, Vic, that when my wife Mel eventually learns at about noon that I'm alive and I'm at Georgetown, she does her best to get up there, and that takes her about 2 hours. So she gets to me around.
It took her 2 hours to get from Lorton up there. I bet that was just aggravating and just agonizing for her.
It really was, because the sergeant major that was a neighbor of ours that was driving her up there, they had the radio on. WMAL was the big news radio station up there.
6:30 a.m.
They had the radio on, and all the hospitals, the news, obviously all the programming for the day changed dramatically, as you can imagine. But all the hospitals, Inova Fairfax, Arlington, even there's some that go to Walter Reed, others, all the hospitals, the news media is reporting the number of casualties arriving. And Georgetown is always one. And it's just, there's no reason I'm alive today but by the sovereign hand of the Lord. And there's so many things that I could tell you. But what I was leading to, though, was when Mel finally gets to D.C. and she links up with me at Georgetown, the FAA has just cleared airspace. This is somewhere around 4 o'clock that afternoon, to fly me from Georgetown to the Washington Hospital Center, which is about 14 blocks north of the Capitol on North Capitol Street, because that's where the Regional Burn Center is. When the Georgetown University Police Department drive her over there, the streets of D.C. are empty, except for some of those third old guard guys that are in Humvees with 50 cals on them, and any law enforcement vehicle. And the last time Washington, D.C. had been that empty and that evacuated from a combat action in the National Capital Region, Abraham Lincoln was the President of the United States.
Wow.
That was a profound day. We hadn't faced an enemy like that in 141 years. And that's why the war on terror is so difficult. One of the many reasons.
You know,
why it's so personal.
You served in the Gulf War, and I'm sure the events that you had to go through at the Pentagon far succeed the threats that you had in the Gulf War. But my
life was never. I mean, I was certainly threatened, but never as physically. I mean, I'm always a bit guarded. I mean, look, what makes the war on terror so difficult is because it is so personal, because it is clearing buildings in Fallujah. In the first Gulf War, I was one of the members of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment task organization that fought the Battle of the 7th Re-Easting, the largest armored engagement since World War II. But when you're and I don't mean but when it's tank on tank or equipment on equipment, while it is far more violent, it is far less personal. Because when you're trying to clear a building and you're fighting a guy with an M16 or an AK as opposed to T-72s, man, that's personal. And the injuries that our veterans that served during the war on terror, the IEDs, other things that were there to just simply cause injuries so that those injuries would cause the American people to say, I quit. That is far more personal. At least I knew the enemy I was looking for and that I was trying to kill. What the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, while not as lethal a fight when you've got an armored corps against an armored corps, far more personal when 1 minute you're walking by somebody and the next minute they're your enemy.
You served. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Vic. I'm getting a bit.
No, that's okay. This is a great conversation. I want to bring up the fact that you served in the Gulf War. You survived the 9/11 attacks. You live, of course. You're a state senator in Texas, and a huge event took place in your state last week, a little over a week ago, there in Southern Springs. From surviving 9/11, we had the Vegas massacre take place earlier this year, and then, of course, recently there at a small church in the San Antonio area. What was that like, you being a state senator in Texas, in a state where a major tragedy has taken place in the last week or so, and experiencing September 11th? Did you reach out to anybody that family members that lost lives or anything like that? Did you do anything in that regard?
No, that's well outside of my district, and if called upon, when Hurricane Harvey was making landfall, some of the assets, boats and things like that, folks had reached out, and we got folks down there out of our county down to in the Beaumont, east of Houston area, and other places around but if I may speak boldly for a moment, Vic, the thing that hurts my heart about that is that, look, we live in a fallen, sinful world. Evil men made an evil choice on the morning of September 11th because they believed it rational to fly planes into buildings. And this guy made an evil choice, and he believed it rational to go kill and shoot up a church. That's not government's duty. Remember, the Declaration says life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that to protect these rights, governments are instituted among men. My duty is to protect your rights. And the Second Amendment and my state constitution, I assume Wyoming's, has a similar. My duty is to protect that right. Government is not going to heal this problem. Our churches. This is not just a mental illness problem. This is a spiritual soul problem. And only churches can solve that. And until our churches get re-engaged in the culture and stop staying inside the church, this disease, this evil that is the culture war that we're in, the battlefield is outside the church, not in it.
Very
and
true.
That's where we are.
Well, Senator Birdwell, once again, you're going to be speaking at the VFW Post 9439 there in Casper, Wyoming. It's about 2 hours away from us. This Saturday from 4 to 5:30 p.m. Now, of course, what would you say to someone that, I was in high school. There are a lot of our demographic for listening on this program. Was affected in 9/11. Either they know someone or just even living here in Wyoming knew what that day was. It's like those that are older than me that remember when John F. Kennedy was shot and killed and assassinated. What would you say to those to remember and ways that we've improved over the years, but we still have some things to do? What would you say to that?
It's hard. I always remember the day. Mel and I take the day to make sure that we're together. We remember the Lord's grace. We always remember the good that eventually came out of that day. From a national perspective, I remember I was in ICU and didn't see a lot of it, but the good that came out of coming together, churches were opening their doors, and in those immediate days and months following September 11th, we were on our knees to the Lord as a nation. God wasn't kicked out of government in those days. For those generations, and you're exactly right, Vic, because when I'm in high schools now, was in one just last week. Everybody that if they're 17 or 18 years of age, they were 1 or 2. They don't have any memory of September 11th. So it's a history book event to them. kind of like Pearl Harbor was to you and I.
Mm-hmm.
And remembering most of all this, and this is what this rally and this meeting is about. There are men and women buried around this world and in this country that paid the ultimate sacrifice for your freedoms and for the vision that the Founding Fathers had for representative republic government. Don't let it go to waste by not caring about the structure of your government. Don't let it go to waste. Don't let those sacrifices go to waste because we didn't think enough about the concerns of our government, whether it's at the federal, state, county, city levels. The best way to remember those lost that day is to be before the Lord, thanking Him for the blessings, because even with all our problems, this is still the greatest nation on earth, because I've been in a lot of nations, Vic, that a Porta-John is a major home improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And every other veteran has got the same story. This nation is overwhelmingly blessed, even with all of our problems. That's the best way to remember it, because that's what Mel and I do. I wish I had more to tell you,
mm-hmm.
but just remember those that have paid that price, just like we did this past Saturday, and we'll do a Memorial Day. God bless each and every one of you. I look forward to being in Wyoming, visiting with folks there. I hope to make a 2-hour drive from Gillette to Casper worth it for you, buddy, okay?
I will do my best, sir. Thank you very much for talking with us today. Great story.
You're welcome. Thank you, Vic. You take care.
All right, you too. Once again,
all right.
Thanks again.
Thank you.